Okay, there we go. So do not disturb.
Okay, he's right now. We're going live. You ready? Summer. Good morning. This is the 11th Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show, and this is the second of 3 interviews with our distinguished activist scholar, Dr. Akinyele Umoja. And the subject that we'll discuss this morning is We Will Shoot Back Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement. This is the book that Dr. Akinyele Umoja has written, and it's an outstanding book, and he'll be able to tell you later how you can purchase this. And this will be the theme for this morning's discussion. Last week, we covered African armed resistance traditions and the various movements, particularly in the 18th and 19th century in Africa, which was the period in which Africans who were enslaved were brought into this country in large numbers. And we were talking about those resistance traditions and how they played out to some extent in the Western Hemisphere. We mainly focused on those resistance traditions in Africa, and we'll see today how they played out today. So this is going to focus on the Mississippi freedom movement, 50s and 60s, and its armed resistance tradition. And I really want to stress this book is outstanding book. And what I consider outstanding is when people do original research and then they nuance their stuff. It's not black and white. And that's what he did. And that's usually what happens when you go to primary sources. So this is going to be a real excursion for you. This is going to be no longer than 2 hours. And then after that, we'll be shutting it off. This will not be any questions or answers in this show. There will be in the next. And the third one, we'll be dealing with current conditions that affect our people when it comes to the right wing, the Proud Boys, and the rest of them, and some of the things that need to be done for us to just put ourselves in a position where they won't be proud anymore. In fact, I don't think they're proud now. That's fake pride.
Yes, sir.
So Akinyele, this is a real pleasure having you on again. And
yes, sir.
As you noted, that wasn't me interviewing you. It was a dual interview. It was a conversation.
It was a conversation. When I put it on social media, I said it was a conversation with Oba T'Shaka. Yeah. Who knows? Because you were in Mississippi during part of the time the book was written, so you can. Who knows? Some of this may be a conversation also. But I'm happy to be back. Happy to be with you again. Again, as I stated last time, it's rare that I get to have a conversation with somebody who's known me as long. We've known each other since the early 70s. I think I met you in 73 or 4 as we were preparing for the 6th Pan-African Congress. And of course, I didn't get a chance to go, but you were leading the California delegation. I think we would have, it wasn't California, it was the Western region, right?
Yeah, right.
And we were one of the only regions in the United States that came out with a strong position paper that went and kind of guided our delegates going over to Tanzania at that time. So I've known you for a long time. I was a young guy in the movement then. I'm not a young guy anymore. I'm an elder in the movement.
Yeah, since 1973.
Yes,
and, because the Congress occurred in 1974. Yeah, and I've followed you. We've interacted a lot, and I'm really proud of how you've grown and developed, both as an activist, a warrior, and as a scholar, and good family man, good human being. And so People are getting a real treasure here. What I wanted to do was start off where we ended off last week, just to lay a connection that we didn't discuss, though it was a topic for last week. And this one has to do with the role of African secret societies in the transmission of African American armed resistance traditions.
All right. All right. Well, that's a much untouched on topic. Now, I don't know if we mentioned last week that, and then you actually in our pre-conversation, you made me aware of some, but in the movement in Mississippi, and one of the things when I was doing the primary research that you mentioned, when I interviewed some of the particularly S.N.C.C veterans who were young people at that time in 1960. Some of the first people to join S.N.C.C, two brothers in particular, Hollis Watkins, who was the first person from Mississippi to join the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and another brother by the name of MacArthur Cotton. And they're both from rural Mississippi. And they both talked about secret societies. They didn't mention secret societies per se. In fact, it was MacArthur Cotton when I talked to him. I interviewed him in 1994, and he made mention of brothers with ancient connections who in Tylertown, Mississippi, defended that community from night riders. And I said, what do you mean by brothers with ancient connections? And he, he said, brother, if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. And so I would find out years later that, these were lodge organizations, and they played an important role in the movement in Mississippi. But we have a tradition of those organizations. The one I'm most familiar with is the Knights of Tabor, also called the Knights of Liberty, who were formed by a brother by the name of Moses Dixon in Ohio, I believe. And Dixon's organization played a role in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. They became part of the Union Army and the United States Colored Troops, and they played a significant role there. It's also to be noted that that organization played a significant role in the founding of Mount Bayou, Mississippi, and the running of Mount Bayou, Mississippi. It was that organization who embraced this Black doctor by the name of T.R.M. Howard, who would become the wealthiest Black man in Mississippi. And T.R.M. Howard will form his own organization, a secret organization called the Order of Friendship, that played a role in the founding and found the basis of the group, the Regional Council of Mississippi, which became the preeminent organization in the 1950s on launching the Mississippi Freedom Movement. But these secret societies would oftentimes be the ones to provide the protection for the emerging civil rights movement in Mississippi, the NAACP leaders in the 1950s. Later, when you have S.N.C.C and other nonviolent, S.N.C.C and C.O.R.E and other nonviolent organizations come, these secret society members will play a role in the protection of brothers and sisters in the movement, registering folk to vote. I think they, and again, this is a much underdeveloped part of the movement. I think in Mississippi, I also found when you have groups like the Deacons for Defense, oftentimes their membership and the core of their organization would be people who are part of secret societies. In Natchez, Mississippi, where you have the first Deacons for Defense group, a chapter that was formed in Mississippi, their arms were paid for by men who were part of the Elks Association in Mississippi, in Natchez, Mississippi. So these secret groups, and I rely to some degree on Michael Gomez's work, Exchanging Our Country Marks. When I go to secondary work, And he talks about how in our traditional societies in Africa, we had these men's and women's societies, like in Sierra Leone, the P.A.P.O Society, which was a lodge, if you will, where you were initiated and it socialized males into manhood, if you will. And so relying on that tradition, oftentimes we concealed ourselves in Masonic orders and other orders that we would form based upon the tradition of men's and women's societies we had in West and West Central Africa. And so that tradition continued, and that tradition became a significant part of the civil rights movement, and particularly in terms of providing defense, not only defense, but into terms of armed resistance. But if one of the things I found is, and I mentioned T.R.M. Howard again, there's a story of a Black man who was incarcerated in Mississippi because of his political activity. This was documented and talked about in Jet Magazine, in fact. And this particular man said he was able to escape Mississippi. After they were able to get him out of incarceration, he left Mississippi because of what they call the Negro Underground at that particular time. The Negro Underground, it were again these secret organizations and networks that Black people had began to develop who would get you out of town. And there's cases not only in terms of what we formerly called the civil rights movement in the 1950s, but even prior to that, during the time of, when our people are sharecropping in Mississippi, Arkansas, Delta, and somebody had to get out of town. And many of our families, this is another project I like to explore, but many of our families have these stories about relatives who had to leave town. I know my wife's family, her grandfather had to leave Texas and ended up in Washington, D.C. On my side of the family, my mother's family, folk had to leave Louisiana and they ended up in Oklahoma, oftentimes because of acts of resistance. But they were assisted oftentimes by these secret societies that folks were connected to, these lodges that people were connected to, which was a fundamental part of our communities at that particular time. Most of us belonged to men's and women's societies. So that's part of this connection of the secret society to not only the armed resistance, but the foundation of our community. It's hard to take armed resistance outside of the context of the community itself, right? And I oftentimes tell folks when we look at what historians call the Nadir period, this period after Reconstruction, where you find this a period of intense and constant lynching going on in the South. This period of time when Black people were disenfranchised in the South. This period of time that Jim Crow or apartheid was institutionalized and becomes not only formal in local and state, local communities and states in the South, but it becomes a law of the land basically. But this period of time, this nadir period or this low period that historians talk about, Black people were forming our communities, right? So we developed these lodges and secret societies we talked about. We reorganized our families. So when you talk about in your book, the integration trap, and you talk about the continuation of this basic African tradition, a lot of these foundations were strengthened, taken off the plantation from our captivity and enslavement, and expanded to some degree when we had a little bit more space, and we're expanded then. So we developed schools, we developed our families, we developed financial institutions. We provided a basis really of a nation within a nation. during that particular time. And the lodges are an important part of that. And it provides us some bases and some resources that we can begin to fight even harder in the 1950s, right? So that's the argument I make. And so the secret societies are an important part of that and launch really the movement, I would argue, in Mississippi through the Order of Friendship and the Knights of Tabor, which were the foundation of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, the preeminent organization in the movement in the 1950s. Why do I say it's preeminent? Because they organized rallies in rural areas, like up to 10,000 people. So when we think about a small population living in rural areas, to organize major rallies at that particular time, that caught national attention, was covered in Jet as well as in Ebony magazine, which is for us at that time national, right? It was our national media. We were able to get the attention. It talks about in the 1950s emergence of this new fighting man in Mississippi who wasn't going to be run out of the state and who was fighting and determined to get human rights on the soil of Mississippi. And Medgar Evers kind of emerged from that movement at that time, I must say also.
Yeah, this is really important background material. And generally, the historians have missed the depth of this because they were secret societies. And I just want to add that stuff that you just gave is rich because it's at the foundation and it's often taken for granted or missed. First thing about secret societies is P.A.P.O, which was the highest educational system in ancient Kemet, which meant house of life. P.A.P.O was an outgrowth of the secret society systems of inner Africa. It was like the flowering of it, the highest university system that had been created in the world. And it was initiatory. There was a life, death, rebirth, transformation. I do a leadership training thing based on what I call P.A.P.O, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker leadership training, bringing it into today. Now, the secret societies that Africans come out of in enslavement, these are societies now that had to reorganize because colonialism had hit Africa. And so the elders were creating systems for continuing the transmission of culture. And so these transmission centers that they call bush schools were located outside of villages. And they were, as you point out, initiatory systems for men and women. And these people would say of them, you will die, because in the initial initiation, it's the rites of passage from boyhood to manhood or girlhood to womanhood. Great trials, and sometimes people did die, but what they meant is you will die as a child and be reborn as a man or a woman.
Exactly.
The key thing about these secret societies that distinguish them from Kemet's P.A.P.O was a higher educational system that trained everything except the military arts. The military arts were taught at the Pharaoh's palace. The soldiers, the warriors were trained there. But the secret societies in Africa did everything. They prepared people for all skill areas of life, but they were particularly warrior schools, especially for men. But the women were also trained in rough, tough strategies and tactics. These systems really prepared Africans for this horrendous Middle Passage and enslavement. Not that they were set up for that, but the trials that people went through, enslavement would be, a dishonor. It would be an insult to their humanity, didn't dehumanize them, but they were tough and rough already. I mean, these societies were tough places. So what it means is that initiation usually occurred around 18, sometimes 16. Virtually everyone enslaved had gone through these. And so as a result, it means that your saltwater Africans were all warriors and the women were fighters too. So that's the first thing. So the thing that you talked about, the P.A.P.O Society, the P.A.P.O Society was one of the largest of the secret societies. And what happens with secret societies is African institutions are coming under attack. And you discussed some of this last week. And it's disrupting traditional African societies. Secret societies serve to reinforce traditional systems, and they're also the police systems in Inter-Africa. Kings themselves were installed in various ways in which the people were involved in installing them, but secret societies played a big role in that, and kings had a fear of secret societies because if they did wrong, once the people or their systems had decided that they were out, secret societies would enforce that. They were like the policemen as well in societies. So P.A.P.O was the biggest, but they were all over Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're carried into the United States. And we know that in the case of Prince Hall, his African lodge comes out of Barbados and brought into the United States, and then is later gets its official recognition in Britain as a Masonic order, but it's an African lodge. And it claims not to support slave rebellions. It would be stupid for him to say he did, but they did, you know what I mean? So that's one form. The biggest of the secret societies operating in enslavement was the Loyal League, but there were others. And the Loyal League encompassed Africans on the plantation and Africans who were so-called free men and women of color. Martin R. Delaney was a member of the Loyal League. Nat Turner was a member of the Loyal League. And this was a spy system, but this was a warrior system. And whenever they resisted, they were providing an example. They called themselves Himbi. Himbi. This is a translation of African systems of learning. You have to be what you know. So they call Nat Turner Himbi. They call him a Christian. He really wasn't. He was a transition. He was more spirit man with some gospel stuff. And when he was murdered by the slave masters after leading the most successful of the slave rebellion. That is, they killed more white people. That's a measure of success. It was regarded by the Loyal League as a sacrifice, as an example to slave masters of what would happen to them, not what happened to Nat Turner, but what Nat Turner did to them if they did not disconnect themselves from this. And the fact that he was executed in Jerusalem had a special meaning for enslaved Africans. So, your point about after enslavement, the secret societies are the building institution for building almost all the institutions that Blacks developed afterwards. Carter G. Woodson is one of the best sources for this. And he doesn't just talk about the societies that go under the Masonic order. He talks about the societies that were independent of any orders. And so you had societies like a society called the United Brothers of Friendship and Sisters of Mysterious 10. And I should note, in secret societies, there was always a woman in every male secret societies, but there were no men in any woman's secret society.
Mm-hmm.
What does that say?
That's similar from the continent too, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm referring to. Not here. That's in Africa.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's another society called the Mosaic Templars of America. And this was a society organized in Arkansas at the end of enslavement. These two that I just cited come to the surface at the end of enslavement, and they built a huge order of over 200,000 people, not only in Arkansas, but throughout the country. They had a huge building, and they built it on a burial society, which then develops into insurance companies later. So this is a building block often ignored. And the fact that you've got some real detail on how it worked in Mississippi is interesting and important. And I didn't know the connection to the deacons, and that's that's real interesting because they maintain a warrior tradition as well as a developmental tradition because it's traditional African culture that they're pushing. So your observations there are very important. People need to know this and need to know that a lot of Blacks, the older Blacks who are still in these Masonic lodges and stuff, all of those have a Kemetic base when you look at their rituals and everything else. It's very Kemetic based. And some of the older people know what they mean, you know? So, but the idea that it was secret, most Black and white historians don't know too much about them because Africans were tight-lipped. So this is real important. Now, what I want to do is get into.
It's interesting what you said, the Africans being tight-lipped. So
Right.
even when the brother first mentions it to me in '94, and if I didn't express that, or I couldn't prove that I knew anything more, he wasn't going to tell me anything more.
Right.
It wasn't until later, and he confirmed when I went back to him that I was able to find that out and confirm with him and get the information from him then. So yes, I think that's real important that our people recognize that if you hadn't reached a certain level, they weren't going to tell you. You had to find out.
Exactly.
And that was a part of my initiation, I would suppose, too, as someone to be informed, to be entrusted with this information.
Yeah, because they were required to keep it secret. These
Exactly.
were secrets. Even Michael Gomez's book, which I really thank you for turning me onto, it made the integration trap much stronger. And brothers,
Okay.
real good work on it. Changing Country Marks, the name of his book. You know, he also makes reference to a lot of these traditions that you just referred to. Now, the question I wanted to get into on your book is first, could you provide your working definition of Black armed resistance? How do you define that?
Working on as individual or collective use of force um, in the pursuit of our human rights. That's a basic definition of it. But it's the use of force, and there's several ways that comes down. But and I say individual or collective because oftentimes we think of politics, we think of a collective process. But I was inclusive of individual brothers and sisters on the plantation who were sharecroppers, like a Joe Pullen who fought off a mob of white people. I saw that as armed resistance. And so I was inclusive of several different forms of armed resistance. We usually talk about armed self-defense, which is basically the use of force to protect one's life or the life of others, right? And so much of when we think about is armed self-defense, but there's also people who participate in what I call retaliatory violence. And retaliatory violence, the one case I like is there's a case in Okolona, Mississippi. I believe it's in 1976. I can't remember the year, but there's a case where white folks go and they shoot up the Black community. And then the next night, Black people go and shoot up the white community. And that's not self-defense. It's all over at that point, right? But there were some Black people who said, look, it's going to be an eye for eye. If you bring that to us, we're going to bring it to you. And so I include that in what I call armed resistance. Some historians probably wouldn't, but I do. There are guerrilla warfare, and is mentioned in the book. And this was, I know, in 1970, where an office in the Black community, really at a historically Black college, was bombed when the Black community was engaged in a desegregation campaign. And the next night, in retaliation also, but the county courthouse was dynamited, and a white man who it was rumored in the community was involved in the Emmett Till murder. I think it probably wasn't true. I think it was just a rumor, but he was shot. And this happened within minutes of each other. And that happened in West Point, Mississippi in 1970. And that was an act of guerrilla warfare. It's believed that possibly Ralph Featherstone was involved in that activity. And it's rumored that he was seen in that area. And the question was, he was living in DC at that time. Why was he there? And I didn't put all these details in the book because the person who revealed the information didn't want me to put it in the book, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it. But he, it was believed he flew in with a crop duster plane. Somebody dropped him off, and then they took him off after the deed was done. Him and Che Payne, who were killed in a bombing 4 months later after this particular incident. That's an example of guerrilla warfare. But I also include spontaneous rebellions. I was at 11 years old when Watts happened in California, when Black people, because of an act of police misconduct, blew up, and there was spontaneous, unorganized resistance. And of course, we've experienced that even today. This past summer, after the killing of George Floyd, in communities across the United States, we still have these spontaneous rebellions. I don't call them riots. To me, a riot is, I know when the Lakers win the championship, sometimes LA blows up, but it's not in no political intent about it. Because if you go back to my original definition, it's in pursuit of human rights. It has a political intent, even if it's unorganized. And so all these things, all these categories fall under armed resistance for me. I'm a little bit different. There are some historians that only give legitimacy to armed self-defense under the that will fit under your constitutional right to bear arms. And of course, we should use any means necessary. But I do feel these other forms of resistance are legitimate. And according to international law, anything that an oppressed people does, any form of resistance is legitimate if we're a colonized people. And I do see Africans in the United States as a colonized people, as an oppressed people. And we have the right in fighting our oppression to use all of these means, particularly if they're not means that harm innocent civilians. But we are within our right to use all these means, particularly to fight against oppression.
You also made a distinction between various kinds of armed resistance, some of which you would not normally associate with armed resistance, because most people would associate that with guns.
Right.
Make some other distinctions.
Well, to me, is use of force. That's why I say use of force. Right. So if people are using martial arts and using their hands, to me, that's armed resistance. If you're using a rock, a bottle, or a brick, that's armed resistance. I also used coercive violence that we called, or coercive militants, I would say, that was used by enforcers during boycotts as a form of armed resistance. One of my, another historian who's a friend of mine, Emily Crosby, she differed with me about that. And she's from a community where when she was growing up, people used, had boycotts. The deacons and others had boycotts in Claiborne County, Mississippi. That's where many of you know Baba Hannibal. That's where Baba Hannibal lived when he moved from Chicago to Mississippi. But in Claiborne County, there were boycotts just like there were in Natchez and throughout the state of Mississippi. And there was a brother by the name of Rudy Shields who organized these enforcer squads, which were called the Spirit. The Spirit would harass people who violated the boycott. And I considered that to be armed resistance. I know in several liberation movements in South Africa, Zania, and Palestine, when people would use these enforcer squads to not only defend boycotts, but other means of resistance. You remember in South Africa where informants would be dealt with a particular way by people in the community. And I consider that, I extend that to armed resistance because I think it's political. And I think people do that to establish the authority of the movement. You know, when you're involved in a contested space, you're involved in a struggle, at certain points, the movement has to assert its authority to say, to look, we control this space, or that you're going to abide by these particular things, or it won't, you know, we say that slogan, there's no justice, no peace. There won't be any peace. It won't be any business as usual um, if you know, unless you abide by these particular principles or these demands, it's not going to go peaceful. You know, so whether that be shopping at the store, and these stores have been designated as associated with white supremacy or white power structure, then you won't be able to peacefully go in these stores anymore until these things are resolved. And so people did that in Mississippi. There were countless boycotts. I actually think that the boycotts combined with the armed resistance was a major method that was used to bring about some form of civil rights demands, some form of space and respect for Black people to live in dignity in Mississippi from the 1960s. The boycotts are more important um, in changing the dynamic there than nonviolent demonstrations, most definitely. More important is sit-ins. And this, to me, is an important part that's missing from the movement, right? It's not just the armed resistance, but the fact that Black people can collaborate and decide that they're not going to shop, you know. And but I will say the enforcer squad is an important part of that element, because, you know, we have some, just like now we're going through this pandemic, and people are just, some people in our community say, look, I know it might be safer for everybody else if I stayed inside, but I'm gonna go out and party, or I'm gonna go out and do what the hell I want to do. Sometimes I think you need some discipline and a force in our community. And so we talked about P.A.P.O before, right? These societies in our community sometimes help provide the discipline in our community, made sure that people behave. We talked about Ifa last week, and there's an Odu in Ifa, there's a verse in Ifa that talks about how human beings have forgotten how to behave. And also, to get to your work, there's a core of individualism that's been reinforced to us, that's been socialized in us by our oppressors, right? And so there's cooperativism, there's communalism that's a part of maintaining our communities are being lost. So, you know, during that time, during the 1960s, you needed the spirit to make sure that people weren't going to be individualistic, even if they might have decided earlier that they weren't going to shop in these places. Sometimes the individualism says, well, look, forget the movement, forget the demands. I'm going to go shop where I want to shop. And if that happened, there would be consequences for your behavior. Um, they wouldn't kill anybody, but they would spank you a little bit. There would be some form of consequences and repercussions for your actions during that particular time. So I include that type of activity in armed resistance. I think it's political. I think it's coercive, and I think it was intentionally used to gain human rights for our people to live in dignity.
You know, your comments on boycotts and San Francisco freedom movement, while C.O.R.E had this nonviolent commitment, that had nothing to do with our victories. Part of it was boycotts, and part of it was whatever strategy could bring a business to the ground. and enforcement, we did that. When we have church support, church be telling them, don't buy where you can't work. And then we'd have enforcement squads out there telling people you can't go in. So you don't get any choice, you know what I mean? But in most cases, people would go along with it, but there was always people that would slip and slide. You made reference to Ralph Featherstone. I knew Ralph, and beautiful brother. And we dedicated the library in our headquarters when we opened it, the Malcolm X Unity House, to Ralph Featherstone. His wife came out for the dedication. She was a school teacher. I know not only about his assassination, I know who killed him, still alive and blown up during Rat Brown trial, blown up. He was a target because he was brilliant, selfless. He had him a publishing house in Washington, D.C. C.O.R.E. James was there during that time, interacting with them. He was just a mirror of the quality of the activism of S.N.C.C and C.O.R.E, and S.N.C.C especially. I mean, beautiful, beautiful brother. And you got people walking around today with blood on their hands,
I did not know that. I want to ask you about that, I suppose, offline. Another thing about Featherstone was I believe it's in 1966, when you have the march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi, to Dr. King and Kwame Ture and Floyd McKissick of C.O.R.E lead that march after James Meredith had been shot. And at that time, I think Ralph Featherstone's assigned to Neshoba County. Neshoba County is a county where Swerner, Goodman, and Cheney were lynched by local authorities and the Ku Klux Klan. And so it was bastion of white supremacy. And Featherstone was assigned there during that particular time. And when the march came through there, the Klan came out, was bold, I think after the march left the next day, they began to attack the Freedom House. And Featherstone organized people in the Freedom House to shoot back. And that's what stopped the Klan from coming at that time. And that was covered actually in the New York Times. That, now, of course, they didn't acknowledge what they had done, but everybody knew that Featherstone had organized the people to stop the Night Riders from coming through. I think they even shot one of the Night Riders, so he didn't die, but he was peppered up a little bit, as you might say. So he was known as a hero in S.N.C.C for that, and we got to recognize too that Fred. Excuse me, I keep on saying Fred. Ralph Featherstone organized the Freedom Schools in Mississippi. He was director of the Freedom Schools. Because prior to that, he was a special education teacher in D.C. and was buried in Nigeria. Was buried in with Yoruba funeral in Nigeria. So he certainly is a hero, and by the P.A.P.O's library being named for him is a way of continuing that legacy, and is a name we should never forget. We should keep in our libations and uphold. I think that's it's something we need to do. But he's a name, was along with Rat Brown, I think he was named the secretary of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that time, along with Sister Ruby Doris. So Ralph Featherstone's a name we need to hold high.
Yeah, I can picture just how he looked. We were at a retreat. It was some foundation in New York. I think it was a sugar estate or something, and we had a little retreat. And so Feather and I went off to the side, and I had a little conversation with him. I said, because at the time Black Power kicked off the slogan, I was in Washington, D.C. lobbying for some low and moderate income housing that I was building in the Fillmore. And at first I said, these guys are going crazy because Meredith was marching against fear. Well, we had pretty well killed that. What's the issue? that was kind of an individualistic thing, but he was shot with a shotgun, fortunately for him, not a heavier caliber weapon, and he survived. And then the march went on. So I'm saying, well, what is the point of this? But then when they got up and started, saying Black Power, I said, okay. And so Feather and I were in a retreat a couple of years later, a year or two, whatever. And I said, Feather, I said, SNCC people in the movement generally had some humility. So if you offered a criticism and if it was valid, we'd bow to it. That's how we won. You getting arrogant, that's how you lose. But basically, he's just a good human being. So I said, hey, Feather, SNCC had a great idea in group-centered leadership. That was a great thing. But I said, and we were joking, I said, when you had Stokely Starmichael, he was my friend, Carmichael. I said, when you got a star up there and you all started pushing Black Power, you had leadership, and your leadership was going beyond the South into the North. And I said, because of your belief in group-centered leadership, which was correct for its time, y'all didn't know how to transition into how you provide some leadership. And I think you got caught in that. You had a slogan, but you didn't know what to do with it. And I gave examples. Kwame would come into a community and speak, a couple hundred people, and leave, no organization.
Right.
And so he said, yeah, you're right. You're right. That was him. He was also humble, absolutely brilliant, absolutely dedicated. You know what I mean? And it's a shame that he was taken out. I mean, just a beautiful, 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 brilliant spirit. I didn't know some of the stuff you just talked about, but I'm not surprised. And he's the type that wouldn't go around bragging about it.
Yeah, from my understanding that when he came to Mississippi from DC, they always practiced armed self-defense, even though the policy of the organization was was nonviolence. They said that he wasn't for being beaten or the passive resistance of the movement at that particular time. Featherstone was, interested in organizing economic cooperatives, things of that nature in Mississippi while he was down there. He again, I agree. He was one of the most important grassroots leaders in the movement, and was supportive of the local organizers and how he could best provide support, whether it was organizing the freedom schools, whether it was organizing economic cooperatives, or whether it was organizing armed self-defense, which I think was one of the reasons he was revered by his comrades in the organization. So I think there needs to be more documentation of his contribution for young people. I'll say this about Featherstone too. From what I understand, in 1969, he was a part of a group of young people in the organization, or people in the organization, who decided that they were done with the attacks like the Swerner, Goodman, and Cheney, and others, without some sort of retaliation. And so they met secretly to decide to respond to it. And I'm told that the action that occurred that I mentioned earlier, where the county courthouse was bombed and the gentleman was shot, was a part of the response of that particular element of the movement. When we think about developments, people talk about things like the Black Liberation Army. Some people just associate that development in our movement to the Black Panther Party. And, what people don't understand is there's this tradition of underground resistance going back to the plantations, right? Going back to our enslavement, that included a whole lot of forces in the Black Liberation Movement and the Black Power movement. And, this being one element, and Featherstone representing one element of that movement. And so when we think about even, you mentioned Rap Brown being captured in New York, fighting against drug dealers. That's an aspect of this movement, this underground movement that emerged during that time to respond to the oppression of Black people.
Yeah, Rap Brown's a brother that needs our support now.
Yes, sir.
What I wanted to do was just a little bit more background in terms of African armed resistance movements in the U.S., background for discussing the 50s and 60s in Mississippi. And I wanted you to just discuss briefly how armed resistance traditions emerged and manifested themselves during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. And what were some of the difficulties that people faced, some of the varied forms of resistance people had, including armed resistance.
Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. I think in Reconstruction, armed resistance, really the possession of weapons was, I think, one of the major demands and desires of our people. I mean, we think about it, during our captivity, because the slavers, the slaveholders didn't want us to have the ability of us to defend, protect ourselves, or to organize for our liberation, our freedom. They wanted guns out of our hand. So coming out of enslavement, people wanted to have protection. Not to mention the fact that 186,000 of our men, our male ancestors fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. So many of them wanted to be able to protect their freedom. I remember you mentioned Martin Delany before. Martin Delany, who was a major in United States colored troops, went and talked to troops. There was documented record because they were surveilling him, of him saying, "Look, there are 200,000 of you now. You know how to use arms. You've been trained, and we need to, get land. And we need to have our freedom." And so that was a major desire. And there's tension after the end of the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, because these former Confederates, particularly local police groups, didn't want to see or were threatened by Black men coming home from the military. There was moves to get us out of the military, and at a certain point in Reconstruction, there's a move to try to disarm Black people. They armed us initially to defend the Reconstruction governments in the South. But then as they made their compromises between the Democratic and Republican Party, right? The Democrats in the South, the Republicans in the North, as they began to compromise, and particularly with the Hayes Compromise of the election of 1876, where the troops were removed, but Black people were also disarmed. And the Confederates, I will say, also did actions in the courts to disarm these Black militias that had been formed. But Black militias actually maintained in the South, they tried to maintain their organization as much as possible. I've even found cases here in Atlanta of skirmishes between organized Black militias and white civilians as late as the early 1900s. So we tried to, as best as possible, maintain some community organization, some posture of self-defense, even though the federal government was attempting to disarm us and disrupt us. But there was always this tradition of us defending and protecting ourselves. And even when we couldn't be organized or we weren't organized in collective groups, and the book talks about several cases of Black men in particular protecting and defending themselves from white civilians. So that's something that is a part of our human rights and the thing that we tried to maintain and continue.
Yeah, and under very difficult circumstances, no other
Now,
Africans, other than Africans maybe in Australia, face the kind of violence in the hands of whites that we face, because this was a successful settler colony, becoming successful, wiping out Native Americans. So to maintain a retaliatory or any kind of insurrectional, any kind of defensive violence was very difficult in these circumstances.
right.
You got whites armed to the teeth. And as you point out, every effort being made to take arms out of the hands of blacks, and still we're able to resist. I think this is a marvelous testimony to the power of black folks. You know,
No doubt, no doubt. I think it's important the way you contextualize it, that this is a white settler colony, and the propaganda we're given when we're being socialized in the educational system is that, it's one nation under God, right? Not it's a white settler colony. That's the way it was founded. And because of that, just like South Africa, just like Zionist Israel, that they want to suppress the indigenous population, or in our case, the African population in this country, to keep us unable to defend ourselves. And this is part of the dilemma that's still going on. I guess we'll talk about next in our next session. The dilemma that's still going on with us in the police, with us and white civilians, with us and security guards inside the United States right now. The dilemma that still persists. Just this morning, as I was, getting a little exercise in, they talked about the case of the young man in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, who was killed and just raising his cell phone when the police came for a noise complaint. But just that's this posture that we're, an occupied space, and we're to be dealt with in that way, not dealt with in a way that of any sense of community and public safety, but of a posture of occupation, and that's what we continue to deal with. So if we don't contextualize it in the frame of that we live in a country that's founded on settler colonialism, then we are really dealing in a situation where we're not really politically and ideologically armed to deal with the oppression that we're dealing with and to change our situation.
yeah, like we think we're citizens, and oh, why aren't we being treated right? Hey, this is the nature of the system. You better.
Right, right,
And the
right,
question is, how do you treat them when you face this, if you can?
right.
Now, getting into your book, as you pointed out in your book, We Will Shoot Back, in April of 1955 in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, 13,000 Black people assembled to take part in a rally organized by Dr. T.R.M. Howard and the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. Could you describe who Dr. T.R.M. Howard was and the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, including their aims, objectives, and how they tied into the tradition of armed Black resistance in Mississippi?
T.R.M. Howard was a Black man from Kentucky, born in Kentucky, comes to Mississippi and Mount Bayou. Mount Bayou, for those who don't know, is an all Black town, founded after Reconstruction, and emerged as a Black town. And they recruit Dr. Howard. They have the Taborian Hospital, which is formed by the Knights of Tabor, one of the secret societies we mentioned earlier. And they hire Dr. Howard. He comes there, and he emerges in the 1940s as one of the wealthiest Black men in the state. And at that time, they said he was a credit to his race. In 1946, I believe it was the Saturday Evening Post. They called him the credit to his race because he wasn't trying to desegregate, right? And he had used his resources to create a park for Black people. It was the first park for Black people in the state. Use his resources to create a pool the Black people could swim in, and oftentimes tell folks that it's important for us to have a pool. My father was born in a place in that county called Alligator, Mississippi, because a lot of I think about it, a lot of our people were swimming not in pools but in lakes and ponds that had alligators, water moccasins, rattlesnakes, things of that nature. So he created a pool for Black people. Created his own insurance company and hired an enterprising young man by the name of Medgar Evers. But they didn't see him as somebody who was trying to again desegregate. He created this organization called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, and they thought it was just an organization trying to get not desegregate, not challenge white folks, but get maybe to make this separate but equal real, to get resources in the Black community. But lo and behold, they had this campaign, don't shop where you can't, or don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom. Because, I remember I was born in 54. And when my family traveled throughout the South during that particular time, my parents had to be judicious as to where we stopped so the children could use the restroom. So they had this campaign during that time, which alerted white folks, wait a minute, he's not just talking about equality under apartheid, but he's, which is impossible, right? But anyway, but he's talking about getting Blacks equal rights. And so he also began to, regional council also began to campaign for voter registration, saying that they would have the first, Black congressman since Reconstruction if they can get voting rights for Black people. Issue that we're still dealing with in the South today in terms of voting rights and voter suppression, I should say. But anyway, so he becomes a threat, and then he also becomes a mentor for several emerging Black freedom fighters, including Medgar Evers in the South during that particular time. T.R.M. Howard certainly believed in armed resistance. He believed in self-defense. T.R.M. Howard, one example I would use is after Emmett Till is lynched, T.R.M. Howard uses his resources to help finance the investigation into the lynching of Emmett Till. And so he pays armed security for Medgar Evers, a sister by the name of Ruby Hurley, and a brother by the name of Amzie Moore, who dressed up like sharecroppers and went into the cotton fields to get information from the Black people who were witnesses to the occurrences around the lynching of Emmett Till, and that's how they were able to get much of the information. When Emmett's mother would come from Chicago to Mississippi for the trial, he facilitated her travel to Mississippi. She described her travel there as like coming in under the Underground Railroad. But when she comes to T.R.M. Howard's house, she notices that, he has a submachine gun at the house. He got people doing security at the house. And she said, she talked about the people on Mount Bayou didn't tolerate any invasion of any kind, that she was well protected while she was in Mississippi during that time. And it was all organized by T.R.M. Howard. And so he was a person who had armed security always himself, but he also protected himself, knowing that they would try to disarm him. And I mean, the police and, the segregationists. He had secret compartments in his car to hide his gun, things of that nature. So he was a person who was very conscious of that. And the community around him rallied to make sure he was defended and protected as the leader of that movement.
Yeah, I think it would be surprising for most Black people to know that in the 50s, in 1955, as many as 13,000 Black people assembled in the heart of violence, Mississippi,
Right.
with this kind of organizing and everything else.
Well, keep in mind that same county, um, decades earlier, the UNIA would hold rallies, not as large, but about 1,500 people. And so you had this tradition of organizing that went on there. And Garveyites in the South would meet and try to figure out, okay, how can we organize communication? So if white supremacists emerge to our area, well, we're in the majority, but to overwhelm us, they get white supremacists from other counties to come in. How can we get Pan-Africanists and Garveyites to come from different places? So this is something that Black people have been thinking about even for decades prior to the formal civil rights movement emerging with the movement of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so I'm proud. My father is from that county, so I'm proud of that county. And that people were thinking about that during those times.
Yes, some people who really know the Garvey movement know this. Most people don't. The Garvey movement's base was Southern. I mean, his headquarters was New York. His second best chapter was in Philadelphia, where Eason was based. But the base of his movement, 75 chapters in Louisiana alone.
Right.
And in Terror Town,
Right.
literally Terrorville. And a lot of these Blacks were armed. And so that is really saying something about the spirit of Black people who are still undergoing this post-Reconstruction terror, that they are open to an organization like this and are the main motive force of it. And in fact, I would argue this: Garvey came in a supporter of World War I. He supported the King of England. He wrote him a letter telling him how much he loved him and everything else. It's Black people who woke him up, and particularly Blacks at the end of World War I. In the Universal Negro Improvement Association papers done by Hill, which is a huge amount of documentation. In one of them, it gives the account of Garvey going to a meeting in New York and held by Hubert Harrison's Liberty League. And it's the first time he really connects with the real spirit of Black people. And it's at that time he discovers race consciousness. Race conscious Black people woke Garvey up. And that was through an anti-war spirit that they had after coming back and having been used as cannon fodder by the elite NAACP and others who encouraged them to go and fight. They came back angry. You had the Bloody Summers, Blacks resisting, whites who are coming back into the neighborhoods, and Blacks are shooting back. But what he finds is, one, race consciousness, and then what they called the new Negro, which is what King called the spirit of Black people in Montgomery in the 50s when they stood up. And so that woke Garvey up. Then Garvey woke a whole lot of Black people up. And there's more to it that I won't go into. But in fact, when I spoke in Jamaica, I couldn't tell them some of this because this would appear to be an insult. It's just the truth. You know what I
mean? Right.
Everyday Black people did that.
Wow.
That movement. You know what I mean?
I have to hear that analysis. That's important. That's important.
Mm-hmm. Southern Blacks, man.
Right.
Bad.
And don't get any credit. That's part of the motivation for this book is I think the Southern Black folks have been misinterpreted by historians and by movement folk, right? And so they don't see that nationalism. They don't see that militance, that spirit of resistance that maintained there. And so, we will shoot back is a part of trying to correct that history of defining us.
Yeah, I think that for Mexicans, Texas is the closest thing to Mexico, the Tex-Mex, and for the South is really our Africa here.
Right.
We're closest to being African. in that Southern environment. And I think part of what you're talking about is, one, we're not upfront. Blacks are laid back. Southern Blacks especially, they don't advertise this stuff. That's just the African personality.
Right.
And being hospitable and being nice is confused with being subservient.
Right. Exactly.
Far from the case. You know.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, the brother I mentioned, Amzie Moore, who was dressed up as a sharecropper and was a part of that regional council Negro leadership. And it was a person actually when Ella Baker sends Bob Moses to Mississippi. She sends him to Amzie Moore, right? Because through her days of organizing NAACP, he was one of the people. But Amzie Moore was a hospitable Southerner, lived in a place called Cleveland, Mississippi. But they said when he came to your house, if you were going to stay there to do some organizing work, and this was with white civil rights workers too, he would offer you a handgun, not just a glass of water and something to eat and some fresh toiletries. Hey, you might need this too. And so our hospitality extended to protection in some cases.
Yeah, you better believe it. And some of the people you least expect to be defenders could be some of the toughest ones.
Right, exactly.
So this background is really important. The Regional Council of Negro Leadership, T.R.M. Howard, and others as background for what would sustain this movement in the 60s, but on its own right. And I think that this history is very important. And what I should tell the viewers is you're getting even more than this in the book. What he's doing is contextualizing it and giving you other stuff that he couldn't put in the book. But you need to read the book so that you get the in-depth stuff. I keep saying to this younger generation, if you don't read, you can't lead, not even your own self. Because as my sister told me once, she said, if your enemy knows more about you than you know about yourself, you're in trouble. You know what I mean?
That's some good teaching.
A world of trouble. You know what I mean?
and you said you told a younger generation, but that's what you all used to tell us. And so you mentioned our last talk, Julian Richardson, Marcus Books. During those days, Aquarium Book Center in LA, Marcus Books. If you were an activist, if you were aspiring revolutionary, you had to be in those places, getting your books, knowing your history, and not only purchasing books yourself, but you had to be in places of conversation so you could get a collective understanding of what's going on and learn from other people's insights. So that's an important thing that we can't lose in part of our movement culture.
Yeah, and ongoing reading, not just if you go to college or high school, wherever you went, prison, you started reading, and then you stop. It's ongoing.
Right.
Wherever you stop, that's where your development stops. So this reading is really crucial. And of course, reading good stuff. Everything out there ain't worth reading.
Right.
In your book, you talk about the changing conditions affecting Black people globally, and particularly the changing conditions as a result of World War II and the post-World War II conditions. And you talk about how these changing conditions affected the development of institutions and organizations in Mississippi and provided part of the framework and conditions for the emergence of a Black freedom movement, as well as contributing to the Regional Council of Negro Leadership and others. Could you just discuss that briefly, how that context of what was going on in the world impacted what we were doing here?
Well, the World War II, that I like to call the Second Imperialist War. You probably should have the Second European Imperialist War. It kind of shakes up the dynamic. So where you had colonized people in the Caribbean and Africa and in the South, and in, of our colonized nation in North America, we were actually, because of that crisis And because of that conflict, many of our people were drawn in and were served in the military during that particular time. So when I talk about names like Medgar Evers, when I talk about names like Amzie Moore, these were men who were drawn into that conflict, who went and fought, uh, for our colonial oppressors, just like men across, men from, the Caribbean, men from Kenya and Ghana, all went and fought in these places. Um, and also, I think in that context, they got to see and deal outside of their communities with Europeans or white folks in a different way than they would have in their local community. So when they return home, they kind of have different perspectives and they're less likely to take certain things. Keep in mind also that at home, people got to, because of the crisis or what happens during a wartime economy, Black people were placed in different places in the economy. So they began to have different types of aspirations. And this is true of, again, people throughout the colonial world at that time, even in places like Vietnam and other places. And so I think that crisis and that disruption gave us a chance to experience and see different things, and for people to be able to imagine for different things and make different types of demands. I think that helped to refresh the movement in Mississippi and other places during that time. These veterans returning back home, this seeing of the U.S. in a different light. I think another dynamic that shifts after World War II is also the Cold War. And so with the Cold War emerging and the United States beginning to point to the Soviet Union as this major competitor for world domination, world hegemony. The Soviet Union in turn points to the US's contradictions. And so it becomes difficult for the United States to maintain the hypocrisy of segregation while claiming itself as the leading democracy, if you will, in the world, and the lead champion for human rights. And so that contradiction is exploited, I think, by the civil rights movement at that time. U.S. has to be has to intervene on some level when Black people are faced with open armed supremacy in the South. It can't allow major massacres, lynchings, and all that to occur without any statement. And so the movement fills in that space. I think I want to say you all filled in that space, that you all were more aggressive, more assertive in that period, realizing, and I would even like to ask you if y'all were even thinking about it, but from my perception, leaders of C.O.R.E, of S.N.C.C, of S.C.L.C took the initiative during that particular time to recognizing that the United States was in a precarious position. It couldn't call itself, as Malcolm talked about, the champion of human rights around the world, and then at the same time, allow what had occurred previously. If you talk about the period of Ida B. Wells and others, when we're being lynched, um, is no federal intervention at all. I think you all are in a different position and can make assertions on a different level. And at the same time, I think where that goes on, even though it wasn't the lynchings of hundreds of us as it was, because we think about it during the 19 the later part of the 19th century, all the way up until the 1920s and 30s, it was common for hundreds of Black people to be lynched per year. you know, that that dynamic changes. But even with that, on a local level, we still had to have the ability to protect and defend ourselves because our lives were still threatened, as our lives are threatened today. But, you know, again, we'll talk about some of this next week. Um, so we said I wasn't going to interview you on this one, but was that something that was in you all's mind, the position that you are in, and that we needed to be more assertive and aggressive at that point? When I say you all, because you're a leader of the Congress of Racial Equality in San Francisco at that point.
What I'd say is that in my case, and probably for a lot of people, there was an awakening process where we became more conscious as we engaged in the struggle. And in some of our cases, myself, for one, underwent an awakening. And then we really began to see things and see our power potential even more. But what I would say is that for the Northern movement, the Southern movement was real key. And we viewed it, first of all, for me, the Montgomery bus boycott was like the stand-up moment. And I was in high school. Well, I was young at that point. And I I didn't know all the things going on in the world. I wasn't that political. My father was. His consciousness was over my head. He had refused to fight in World War II. Um, but I knew that that was a significant victory, and 97% of Black people had stood up. I was proud of that. And that was one of the things that really motivated me to want to do something. And then the Cuban Revolution. When I was a student at San Francisco State, I was in a debating class. This is around the time that I joined C.O.R.E. But before I really undergo an awakening, and I defend the Cuban Revolution. I was not that conscious. I was definitely not no radical. And I won the debate. And then I challenged the debate professor to a debate, and he refused to debate. And I wasn't that conscious of all the dynamics of the Cuban Revolution. What I understood was they were standing up against an oppressive system, and they had been successful in defeating it. And I liked that, so those were kind of like international things. Now, when I woke up, then I came to my father's consciousness and I realized, well, he'd been telling me this all along, you know what I mean? But I got assimilated through miseducation and believed that this was a democracy and all the rest of this stuff. And so my awakening comes and I'm going back to what he already knew, because he was like Malcolm X, Malcolm, the political revolutionary. My father was the individual revolutionary. He was fighting his battle one-to-one, physically with brass knuckles, and otherwise always with his mouth, with his eyes, taught himself to read and write. He saw when Hitler would lose World War II, he had a prophetic quality just like Malcolm. He said when Hitler went into Russia, it's all over. He's fighting too many fronts. And he was on a train once, and the Japanese were said to not have peripheral vision.
Right.
Reading a newspaper where they actually dropped bombs down American smokestacks and ships, and he started laughing. We went to the draft war. One of the things he told them is, I ain't shooting no Japanese. They look just like me. You know what I mean? So I caught up with his consciousness. What he understood was going on. When I started waking up, I understood. So when I entered the movement, what I'd say, and I would say this about movement activists in general, we assumed that our leaders had the answers. We were soldiers. I was a soldier in the Army. Literally, I'd just been out of the Marine Corps for 6 years in the reserves and didn't know better. John Wayne, that image had got me in there. But when I woke up, I realized something else. And I'd been a lieutenant colonel in the ROTC, second in command of all the units. I'm a soldier. My wife says, you dress like you're in the military. I said, yeah, that's what I am. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's how I see myself. But the point is the awakening of the Southern movement, the understanding of its successes and its importance, and then undergoing an awakening is what really triggered my stuff. And I think a lot of us whether we underwent an awakening or not, began to lead us to start to question the direction that was being provided by our leaders, some of which was good, some of which wasn't. You know what I mean? So,
I think that you mentioned Montgomery, and that's one thing I learned from one of my elders, Max Stanford, Muhammad Ahmed. He talked about how for his generation, for your generation, that a Black community standing up for over a year.
right.
That, because, and as I tell my students, that kind of breaks the stereotype that, hey, we won't stick together.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, you can't, no one has your back. And so I think Montgomery emerging, what's happening in Mississippi around Emmett Till and Black communities beginning to stand up, I think that's all a part of that motion beginning to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beginnings of this movement. The thing that gets me about Montgomery, and people miss too, is Rosa Parks had been an activist since 1940, since the early 1940s. Montgomery, the bus boycott wasn't her first rodeo. That she was leading a campaign about the lynching, or not lynching, the sexual assault against a Black woman, Reese Taylor, since 1944. And so Rosa Parks was a seasoned activist. Her grandfather was a Garveyite. Her husband believed in armed self-defense. Rosa Parks believed in armed self-defense. But we've been given this narrative of Rosa Parks that doesn't fit who this freedom fighter actually was. And so that, people like that made up that Montgomery movement.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and old Garveyite and her family was, and really respected Malcolm X. She had respect for Malcolm.
And Robert Williams.
Yeah, oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she had that genteel, she was the more delicate type of Black woman.
Right.
But made of steel. And so, you had very polite and very nice and would take no mess. And she had a statement. She was at the Highlander School a couple of weeks before the Montgomery bus boycott. You may know this. And she said, the Negroes in Montgomery are never going to get together. It's just too hard to organize them. 2 weeks later, look who's the spark plug.
Right. Because sometimes we don't recognize the groundwork we've been doing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But we surprise ourselves, because one thing I say is, the one thing you can't do with us is predict what we're going to do. I don't care how well informed you think you are, we're going to surprise you, and sometimes in a very positive way.
Right.
Now, so looking at that international context, you had made reference to the fact that Ella Baker had sent Bob Moses into Mississippi, and others, but particularly Bob Moses, who was her primary apprentice, with contacts that she had made. It should be pointed out, Ella Baker was, in my estimation, one of the two best organizers of the 60s, her and Malcolm. I used to say Malcolm, but the more I studied Ella Baker, I'd say you really can't say, because it's apples and oranges.
Right. Now, she's the master teacher.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to talk about mass organizing. She actually did more.
Right.
I mean, look at the number of people she really recruited as the director of organization, NAACP, and in a very difficult set of circumstances in the South, where she was under constant threat. That was beyond just good. That was magnificent.
Right.
Those two were like two, I think, top tier. Those are the two best, those two, in my opinion. Malcolm built the best disciplined organization in the history of Blacks in this country, the Nation of Islam, and didn't get a chance to really do the organizing that prepared him to do when he got out. Only had a year and then got knocked off, but he had the discipline, the organization, and the brains, as Ella Baker did. So those.
You're gonna make me ask you another question then.
Go ahead.
So where would you put Marcus Garvey?
Oh, I think in the 20th century, he would rate number one because of the scope of his organizing. I don't think anyone did better overall general organizing. Now, when it comes to discipline and stuff, it's another story. But you're looking at continents that he impacted
Right.
all over the world. I don't think anybody equals him. And plus, look at him. He's the influence on Malcolm. He's the influence on Elijah. He's the influence on a whole lot of stuff. And he had weaknesses too. I ain't going into that now, but he had weaknesses. But the key thing is the scope of that organizing. Wow.
Right. Well, no doubt.
Every continent.
No doubt. No doubt.
I put him top tier, and he's my first master. I studied him, and I learned economic development from him.
Right.
With some other stuff, you know what I mean? Which he was good at, you know. So you had discussed Ella Baker and how she had had contacts that she had developed through her earlier organizing that she linked S.N.C.C up to. And I think it's very important to note that because S.N.C.C is generally taken out of context and just viewed as a youth organization.
Right.
When in fact, it had an intergenerational makeup.
Exactly.
And some people said no Ella Baker, no S.N.C.C.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
So
and that's a key example of when Moses goes to Mississippi, who's the S.N.C.C first S.N.C.C organizer. Ella Baker gives him list of contacts and then direction on how he should interact when he goes to Mississippi. And so without that, these stories that we've talked about in terms of S.N.C.C and Mississippi Freedom Summer, all of that doesn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ella was something else. Miss Baker, I should say.
Right.
Miss Baker, because that was in the movement to respect Southern Blacks, especially Mr. and Mrs. You know what I mean? Always. You don't call them by their first name.
Miss Ella Baker.
Yeah. Quite a lady. And by the way, Queen, always dressed regally, always had her a hat and gloves. And she would often leave her hats on trains and they'd have to go and try and relocate them. She was a disorganized organizer, by the way. She was a hell of an organizer, but her stuff was all over the place.
That's funny.
She is a lady of great dignity, you know what I mean? And private life, you didn't know nothing about her marriage or nothing else. John Henry Clark said her husband was outclassed by her. Actually, her husband reproduced her grandfather. He looked like him because she liked dark complexioned Black men. It was a part of the light skin part of her heritage relating to Blackness. And so her grandfather was Black as midnight, loved her to death, bad Black man, ex-slave, bad Black man. So her husband, who wasn't all that political, fit the bill. It was partially her grandfather and her father, but she was Black. And by the way, I would say another thing I say about Ella Baker that most people wouldn't say, she was a nationalist, but she was an African-American, non-ideological nationalist by choice, because she was a mature revolutionary, but she was a situational thinker. She wasn't abstract. She wasn't somebody with all these theories hanging on trees. Her stuff walked. It was based on life. So I call her a situational revolutionary.
Well, since we're on the question of Ella Baker, and we're talking about armed self-defense, let's say a few things about Ella Baker and self-defense.
Yeah, definitely.
Ella Baker actually at a key point in S.N.C.C's development as in 1964 on the eve of Freedom Summer. And there's a debate in the organization because the members in Greenwood, Mississippi, had started placing guns in the office, and it's supposed to be a nonviolent organization. So they have this debate back and forth. They found out that there were two developments. One was that local people were telling them that they were a hit list that the local intelligence unit, which is basically domestics working in white folks' homes, found out that there were a hit list of some of the major local leaders and S.N.C.C folks, including Bob Moses. And that was one development. And the local people were saying that SNCC people needed to be armed.
Oh.
The other development was that you had members from the Revolutionary Action Movement, your comrade and friend, C.O.R.E, at that time's name was Roland Snellings, and Max Stanford were in and organizing in that office, and they were encouraging people to be armed. And so that created a little conflict. And then on the other end, there were some people in SNCC saying that this was going to cause more retaliation from the Klan, and they needed to get the guns out of the office, and it was, it's against the organization's philosophy. And so a gentleman by the name of Charles Cobb, who's the author of the book, That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, he said something at that time in the meeting. He said, well, what if I'm in the home of one of our local people we're organizing, Mr. E.W. Steptoe, and he's killed by the Klan, and the Klan is coming in the house, and the gun's laying on the ground, and the wife and daughter are in the house. Should I leave, or should I pick up that gun and defend Mr. Steptoe's family? And, no one knew how to answer that question. And Ella Baker intervened, and she said, look, if SNCC doesn't defend the right of Charlie Cobb to protect Mr. Steptoe's family, then this isn't the organization I thought it was. And, it was critical at that moment in the movement. And I think they, even though they still tried to maintain their policy of nonviolence, they would defend the right of activists to, carry guns in that type of situation. She also was a supporter of Robert Williams and the Monroe movement. And after Robert Williams was forced into exile, she visited Monroe and to find out what was happening. And in Monroe, North Carolina, in 1961, when she was still a member of the NAACP. Well, I think no, excuse me. She's by that point she's with SCLC, but she was a supporter of armed self-defense and of people who participated in armed movements. But that's not generally talked about when we talk about Ella Baker.
Ella Baker was pugnacious. She was a fighter as a kid. The white sheriff in her area called her by the N-word, and she kicked his butt. And her family didn't react and say, oh, your life is in danger. They encouraged it because she had that kind of resistant family, so she came from a Black community that gave her that support, a Black family that gave her that support. And then she defended her own brother. She was the physical fighter as well as the spiritual fighter. She had the mouth, but she also had this. That was
right.
At the same time, a lady.
Right.
That's Black womanhood. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, she was something else. I'm sorry I never met her. I just knew of her. I never had a chance to meet her.
Me too.
Yeah. Could you describe the relationship between Amzie Moore and Bob Moses, and what each brought to the table, what Moses and S.N.C.C brought to the table for Amzie Moore and the movement there in Mississippi, and what Amzie Moore brought to the Black freedom movement, and particularly in light of this armed resistance tradition and Amzie Moore's connection to that.
Well, Amzie Moore, as we mentioned, that's who Ella Baker sends Bob Moses to talk to. And Amzie Moore provided for Bob, and we talked about this intergenerational piece before, but he provides the experience of actually organizing on the ground. By that point, by 1960, he had, some years studying under T.R.M. Howard, being engaged in building regional council of Negro leadership, being involved in building NAACP. he had picked up some experience as well as contacts throughout the state. And so he was able to advise Bob. And at the same time, for Bob and then for subsequent organizers, it was AMSI who was called by one person, the one man protection agency, that he made sure that they were also provided with networks of people who could provide them with security support. It wasn't just that, we oftentimes think of these organizers, these young people who came, young people not only who came, but also were people rarely think about the young people who joined, who were from Mississippi. It wasn't just people coming from the North, it was young people who also joined the movement, but they received protection from these older folk who like Amzie Moore and people who Amzie Moore was connected with, and also getting into to some degree into these secret societies that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. That Amzie Moore was the point person to kind of connect folk in this type of way. It's interesting to me, as I mentioned, that we talked about the Revolutionary Action Movement coming to Mississippi. And the Revolutionary Action Movement is a group coming out of the North. Some of them come out of, Bay Area, California. Some of them come out of Philadelphia, New York area. Some of the historically Black colleges in Ohio, things of that nature. But they, organized in 1964, and they're going to go into Mississippi and to begin to organize Black self-defense units. When they get there, they find out people like Amzie Moore already have self-defense units. So it's again, when we talk about these Southern Black people, they already have, it's not an overt, and like you said, an ideological nationalism, but they have a sense of protection, development of the community, and protection of Black life, even, that's indigenous, that comes from where they're at. And Amzie Moore is a part of that. It was Amzie Moore who, I think Max Stanford said that they meet with, after discovering what's in the South, about building and increasing an even broader self-defense network throughout the state to protect these voter registration workers and people around Freedom Summer. And so Amzie Moore provides this direction for Bob. What Bob provides is youth are important in our movement, right? We need, I think that's an important reason why when we have the J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO memo of, I believe it's 1967, they want to cut off young people from joining a movement, because one way to kill a movement is for young people not to be a part of the movement, right? And so Bob and others provide the shock forces, the shock troops, the frontline troops for this movement to go out and register people to vote and to really try to break the back of segregation and disenfranchisement in the South, particularly in Mississippi during that particular time. So you needed the Bob Moseses to come in from the North, but you also needed to organize the local youth from the South. So I mentioned Hollis Watkins before, and Curtis Hayes, who's now Curtis Muhammad, who were the first recruits, but you also had other men and women who or young men and women who joined the movement, who are local Mississippians, who become the core of SNCC in Mississippi. Not to mention the older folks who join, like, or become a part of it, like Fannie Lou Hamer, or your organization, Congress of Racial Equality. It had the folk who would come, like a Rudy Lombard and a George Raymond from Louisiana, and later on a Dave Dennis from Louisiana, who were young Black folks, but then they would recruit, a C.O. Chin, elder bootlegger, and people like that to join the movement. So I think this intergenerational nature of the movement, I think we found during the 1960s and played an important role with with the youth being the ones to go out, going door to door, registering people to vote, trying to encourage people to register to vote. But it was somebody who fed them, it was somebody who gave them transportation, and it was somebody who protected them along the way, as well as they gave them direction of what was going on in the local community. Who could you trust? Who do you need to stay the hell away from? Not only in the Black community, but in the white power structure. How do we deal with them here? And so that intergenerational transmission of knowledge and roles in the movement, I think, was essential. And again, something we don't talk enough about today.
Yeah, and I think Amzie Moore said that one of the things that Bob Moses brought and S.N.C.C brought were certain national connections that aided him in his own organizing in Mississippi. And that included national networks, some of which he had with Ella Baker, but others.
Right.
Also federal, you know. So
Right.
he saw all those hookups because he's a seasoned organizer, and you sometimes get isolated in a state like Mississippi from the broader operation. So he saw that value, and then as you know, he's the one that tells Bob Moses voter registration.
Right. Right. Not they didn't need a lot of desegregation demonstrations, but if they were able to register and get people to vote, then they could take power.
And that's real key. That's real key because they were going to the people finding the direction rather than coming in with their own direction. And that's the only way you organize. If you don't really root yourself in what the people are demanding, you'll be by yourself.
Exactly.
Ella was key because she knew who the hookups were.
Right.
And had S.N.C.C gone in there on their own and C.O.R.E gone in there on their own, it might have taken them forever to find that out. You know what I mean? Or at least it would have taken time, So, that was valuable.
No, it's very important, very important. I think of that even in contemporary context. My comrade, who I know you knew, Chokwe Lumumba,
Right.
and moving to Mississippi, his plan was not to run for government, for city council or for mayor. But as he began to be active, it was local people say, look, we need you to run for mayor, so that, that's where that really comes from. And so you have to go in these communities, you have to listen to people, and you have to learn from them. And then, sometimes they make demands on you too. And that's what happened in his case.
Now, you just referred to it before. I want to go into a little bit more. You talked about there being a network of indigenous leaders in Mississippi. And often we think of movements wrongly as single leaders and this kind of stuff. But you in your writing talk about a network of indigenous leaders in Mississippi who had the resources to support what would later become the Black Freedom Movement, and that had been the basis for the Regional Council, Negro leadership, and other things. Could you describe some of the key leaders of this network of indigenous leaders, some of these key leaders, and their connection to the armed resistance tradition in Mississippi, and the way in which they assisted S.N.C.C and later C.O.R.E in their organizing?
Well, again, when we talk about that period of that historians call it an India period, and for people who are watching and might not be aware, some historians argue post-Reconstruction through the 1920s. I would argue it goes beyond that until the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. But you have this period of time where lynching is coming. You had this period of time where the disenfranchisement happens when Black votes, our voter suppression is at its peak. That segregation, or what we call apartheid, was codified. That we had to have a particular place on public transportation, on the street, in any public activity. that we were segregated. And keep in mind, segregated ain't just us being separate, it's being us being kept in a inferior position. When I say us, I mean meaning people of African descent. And so that was at its peak. And during that period of time, even though it was so low for us, we built our families, we built our lodges, we built our businesses, we built our schools, our churches, these fundamental institutions that provided resources. In our local communities, we did have leaders like T.R.M. Howard, Amzie Moore, a emerging a person like Medgar Evers. We did have the in E.W. Steptoe in Amite County. So we had these leaders who emerged around the state who were in contact with each other. And the formation of the regional council and also the NAACP became the vehicle upon the organizational vehicle that could happen. And I also want to keep in mind that prior to that, when you couldn't have an NAACP throughout the state, you had the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So you had these networks, even when there wasn't a name for organization, where people were in touch with each other. And so this is why when Bob Moses comes to Mississippi, and with the blessing of Ella Baker, that Amzie Moore could send him to Southwest Mississippi. He said that Black people were better organized in Southwest Mississippi than they were in the Mississippi Delta, where Moore was at that time. So in Southwest Mississippi, you had more Black landowners. You had more Black entrepreneurs. You need this resource base to sustain an organizer. As I said, these were the people who fed the organizers, who housed them, who clothed them, who provided them with protection. So without a basic level of resources in our community, you're not going to be able to sustain a movement, right? People, we have some theories of movement that say you got to get support from the outside, but no, it comes from the community itself. And so, for instance, when Moses goes to Southwest Mississippi in a town, Macomb, Mississippi, or a city called Macomb, there's a cleaners, the Nobles Brothers Cleaners, where not only did they financially support him, but sometimes when he's running, this is a place he can go hide. And he's transported in the cleaners trucks around the city when it's hot, right? And so, these entrepreneurs provide him support. There's a restaurant owned by a woman by the name of Aileen Quinn. That's where not only Moses, but other people who they recruit can go eat, eat for free. You needed these basic resources to be able to sustain a movement in a particular community. And again, they had a stronger network there. And so this is why Moses was sent by Amzie Moore to Southwest Mississippi to begin to organize there in places like Macomb or Amite County, where E.W. Steptoe was.
Yeah, so maybe just a little bit more into that, because that was one of the things I found real interesting. Your distinction between areas of Mississippi where Blacks own land, and in a couple of cases, all Black towns, you mentioned one, where it not only did you have economic independence, but it fostered a political kind of independence. And that's provided a base for organizing in Mississippi. Could you go into that a little bit more?
And keep in mind, I want to tell your audience, this isn't something that I started off and I knew all this stuff. I had to do research, and through meeting and talking to local people and observing the patterns, I, developed these perceptions. But another important feature, particularly as it regards to armed self-defense and protection of the movement, was what I call in the book. And I got this from this term from a brother by the name that I mentioned before. Um, excuse me, lost his name right quick. MacArthur Cotton, who was one of the early people who joined S.N.C.C from Atala County, Mississippi. But he used the term haven communities. What he meant by haven community is there was these communities, particularly communities of Black landowners, uh, where people had a strong sense of self-reliance and self-defense. And so they knew if they were in these particular communities, they would have safety. One particular community was a community C.O.R.E organized in called Harmony, Mississippi. Harmony, Mississippi is just east of Jackson. And Harmony in that particular county, Lee County, Mississippi, it was known as the Lion's Mouth. The white supremacists went in, they weren't going to come out. And, because again, Black people had this sense of community. And this is one of the communities I mentioned where what I said, example, retaliatory violence. I think white supremacists went in and shot up a Black neighborhood, and Black people the next day went into their neighborhood and shot them up. So they were kind of fierce Black folks. They didn't take no, stuff, if you will. And so Mileston in Holmes County, and another community of Black landowners, they knew if they were in these particular places, they would be safe. Tylertown, I mentioned earlier, we're in Tylertown, Mississippi, and this is MacArthur Cotton was one of the people who told me this story. They said before they came into that community, it was told to them that night riders were warned not to come into the Black section of town again in a invading manner, and they didn't listen to that warning, and they captured one of the white night riders and cut his head off and put it on the bridge that separates the Black and the white community. There were no more night riders after that point. And so so they knew if they came in that particular part, and when I say they, the voter registration workers, the S.N.C.C workers, the C.O.R.E workers, if they knew if they came into that town, they would be safe. And so again, these are stories of resistance and stories that make you proud. If you're a freedom fighter, if you identify with the freedom fighting tradition. And so we had these communities where we had these resources. I think that land owning gave Black people a sense of self-reliance and protection. I kind of when I remember presenting this one time, and one of a woman by the name scholar I respect, Beatrice Morales, she described these as like maroon communities, these haven communities in the state of Mississippi during that particular time. So I look at them in that type of tradition, places and spaces that we have more of a sense of dignity and self-reliance. We're willing to protect and defend what we got too.
Yeah, it's very important to know, because particularly if there's one place where it wouldn't exist, it would be Mississippi, where terror on top of terror.
Right.
It seems like the tougher the situation we're in, the rougher we get. And Mississippi is a perfect example of it. I told you before, they called my great grandmother, who was from Mississippi, a wampus cat. My mother said, "What did that mean?" I said, she could beat a man or a woman.
Right.
And my mother, who was very pretty, and she was athletic and all this stuff, but she's like my wife, a lot of mouth, but she's gone south if it comes to a fight. Not that she couldn't, she didn't want to get her beautiful self messed up. One time in school, where it happened to be a Mexican, messed her up. My great grandmother, this was in a white town, this is after Mississippi, walks her to the house. The father standing outside, gives her a stick, told her to go inside the house and whip that girl. And the father is standing there, he dare do nothing because my grandmother would have kicked his butt. You know what I mean? So Mississippi bad. You know what I mean?
No doubt. No
Of
doubt.
course, they cut two ways. When you got a whipping from Mississippi bad, that wasn't exactly what you wanted. You know what I mean?
No doubt. No doubt.
Now, you know, you're talking about SNCC. Now, you point out after 2 years of organizing in Mississippi, C.O.R.E became involved, Congress of Racial Equality and Mississippi Freedom Movement. And Dave Dennis was like the first organizer. He's still there working with Bob Moses on his algebra project.
Right. No doubt. No doubt.
Brother. And he's got a son that looks just like him, just
Right.
like he looked when he was younger.
I haven't seen Dave in a while. Good brother, though.
He sure is, both of them.
Yeah.
So why did Dave Dennis, who was C.O.R.E's first organizer in Mississippi, pick Madison County and its seat, Canton, as the base for C.O.R.E organizing in Mississippi, and particularly describe who C.O. Chin was? You mentioned him briefly, who became a C.O.R.E organizer. Describe C.O. Chin's connection to the Mississippi Black armed resistance tradition in Mississippi, and he would kind of span it.
Well, I think Madison County is chosen because Madison County at the time was 75% Black. And I can't remember the number of registered voters, but it's low. It was very low percentage of Black people who were registered to vote at that time. And so C.O.R.E chose Madison County. Madison is just north of the state capital of Hines, too. So it is strategically located. And again, was majority Black. Canton was a county seat at that time. And, you know, I'm thinking about this because the demographics of the county has shifted now, but it's still majority Black. And so that's why it was selected. C.O. Chin was really brought into the movement by, you know, I think it was George Raymond was a co-organizer who comes to Mississippi to organize there. He's brought in, he's really just like a local person who was really a bootlegger and wasn't the person you think of as a traditional civil rights leader. But because, you know, he's respected in the community as an entrepreneur, whether it was, as the Panthers used to call it, illegal capitalism or illicit capitalism, or, you know, he also had a restaurant and other businesses. He's respected in the community. He's respected on the streets. And we talked about him last week as being one of those bad Negroes, if you will, who's willing to fight back. He served in the military with the sheriff of the town, Billy Noble, and they would go at it. They would fight. As people describe, they would have fist fights, and sometimes C.O. Chin would refuse to be arrested by anybody but Noble. And they would go at it sometime, and whoever won the fight would determine whether C.O. was going to jail or not. So he's kind of a legendary figure in the movement at that particular time. He's older than most of the folks that come in, so he knows the lay of the land. He's one of, as was described by Ann Moody in her book, Coming of Age in Mississippi, he was one of the protective guys who made sure that the C.O.R.E workers were protected in Mississippi. C.O.R.E workers were protected, I should say, in Madison County. But his deciding to join the movement and support the movement helped bring street people and common day Black folks into supporting C.O.R.E's effort. And in Madison County at that time. Let me see. I'm gonna have to plug up. So you go ahead. I'm hearing you. I'm just plugging up.
Okay. You had made reference before to the Deacons for Defense and Justice. Could you go a little bit more into who the Deacons for Defense and Justice were, including their aims and objectives and the role they played in armed resistance in the South, including their relationship to C.O.R.E.
Well, the Deacons for Defense is an organization that was born out of the movement, C.O.R.E. really, in Louisiana. And a lot of people associate them with the town of Bogalusa, Louisiana, which is in the southern part of the state, but they actually were formed in the northern part of the state in a place called Jonesboro, Louisiana, in Jones County, Louisiana, Jones Parish, I should say. Their parish is in Louisiana. And how they're formed is the initial deacon group that was formed by your friend Ernest Thomas, who's known as Chili Willie. He's one of the founders of it. Was the Klan had a tradition of coming into the Black community and harassing Black people, harassing Black women, sexually harassing Black women, making Black men dance, shooting at their feet, things of that nature. But one particular weekend when they decided to parade through the Black community, they were they had a police escort. And so some Black veterans, here we talk about veterans again, came together. It was a group of 12 people. Most of them were World War II or Korean War vets. And they decided they were going to inventory the community, find out not only who had guns, but who had the ammunition. And they decided to form a group, and they started to provide a sentry for the community, which stopped the Klan incursions. Around the same time, the Klan was picking up its activity in Bogalusa, Louisiana, and a brother by the name of Robert Hicks, who was head of the Voters League. He began to meet with other people, Charles Sims, who was a local insurance salesman, and they formed a paramilitary group. They found out about the Deacons for Defense formed in the northern part of the state, and they hooked their paramilitary group up with the Deacons. And so it became a statewide organization. And their presence, particularly in Bogalusa, because Bogalusa had a strong movement with Hicks and others, a strong Voters League. They had a strong Black working class base with the Crown Zellerback paper mill in town. And so a strong labor component. C.O.R.E. was very active there in the movement. And so they got a lot more national attention. And from the work that they did there, people began to want to have Deacons chapters in other parts of the state, other parts of the South, I should say. They grew particularly throughout Louisiana, but in Mississippi, there was an incident in August 1965, I believe it was, where I think it was outside of Jackson, Mississippi, where there was a white clergyman who was shot by white racists, a white clergyman who was known to be active in supporting desegregation. After he was shot, the community was, in an uproar, but folks said we could bring the Deacons for Defense here, and they could help provide direction as to how we could move forward. And the Deacons, that's when they first come to Mississippi. Within weeks, they Deacon chapter is formed in Natchez, Mississippi. And later that August, I believe, after a Black man who was leader of the NAACP in Natchez, Mississippi, his car, when he was leaving work, explodes when he turns the ignition on in the car. He was targeted for several reasons. One, he was head of the NAACP. Two, he was made a foreman in the plant in a job that white folks felt should be reserved for white people. And so when he was asked to work overtime, all his buddies went home during the regular shift. When he goes out, turns on the ignition for the car, car explodes, but he survived the explosion. But the deacons are already been forming in that community, but they become public after the explosion. They publicly announced that they're going to protect people, and that becomes the first Deacons of Defense chapter in the state of Mississippi. And so we find that for throughout, that was in 1965. Throughout the latter part of the 60s, we find the deacons involved in protecting boycotts, protecting Black communities, protecting leaders in the state of Mississippi, to the point that folks become, when I say folks, white supremacists are really scared of the deacons. So for instance, in a demonstration in a place called Woodville, Mississippi in 1967, the Klan are out there, they're opposing a demonstration of Black people. But when the deacons drive up and get out their cars, the Klan shuts down and they get out of town, right? They leave. And I got corroboration that happened from not only a witness who observed it, from a deacon himself, but also from the FBI files at the time. Said that, the deacons were feared. And it's funny because the deacons, using that more secretive style, they never reveal how many members they had. In fact, they would exaggerate the size of their organization. Natchez, Mississippi, in a county, in a part of the region that had the highest amount of Klan membership at that time, the deacons only had really 12 members. But because they used that, with they're hitting a lick with a crooked stick, that it wasn't Sun Tzu, it wasn't the only one that understood the art of war is deception, but our people and our ancestors recognized that, and so the deacons use that pretty much themselves too. One of the organizers I knew, I know of, Rudy Shields, who I mentioned before, who organized boycotts. One of communities he went into in the Mississippi Delta, in Belzoni, Mississippi, knowing that there were informants in the mass meeting, he said, look, if they don't start negotiating with us soon, we're going to call the deacons in here. The next day, the white power structure is reaching out to negotiate with them. So, the Deacons for Defense were very much a feared organization by the FBI, by the Klan, and by the local authorities.
The Deacons for Self-Defense was, of course, linked to C.O.R.E. And then San Francisco, Ernest Thomas, better known as Chilly Willie, was our West Coast field representative. I was in Bogalusa, as I've told you before, in Mississippi. In August of '65, I was in Bogalusa. At the same time, Chilly Willie was in San Francisco meeting with our chapter. I was on a floor in a Freedom House waiting for the Klan. My girlfriend had brought me told you before, nickel-plated 38 Smith & Wesson Bank of America special. We had just beat the Bank of America. And while I'm laying on the floor waiting for the Klan to come, they're giving me the history of the deacons. And one of the things they told me was, it was the sisters in the church that told the brothers that they wanted them to organize the deacons. You ever heard that before?
No, I didn't hear that. That makes sense though.
Yeah. And, and then when I was in Bogalusa leading demonstrations, the deacons would be lining up on the side, brothers and sisters dressed in their Sunday best to go to the courthouse, and the deacons there with shotguns and rifles and pistols. But Chilly Willie was quite a brother, you know what I mean? He was also a ladies' man, 6'1", tall, dark, handsome. The ladies just, when they see Chilly, they go, oh, Chilly Willie.
What do you expect with a name like Chilly Willie?
And he looked the part. And he worked for Jim Brown for a couple of years after his involvement in the Deacons. Given time constraints, I wanted you to kind of do some overall observations on, in the case of S.N.C.C and their adherence and C.O.R.E, they're talking about nonviolence, but then there's a shift in the movement from that to self-defense. What are some of the things that you think led to that shift? And what implications does that have for today?
Well, one is I believe that their interaction with people in the South, again, is from interaction with the Amzie Moores, with the E.W. Steptoes, with the Chio Chins, with, the Chili Willie Thomases, and people of that nature. The local folks were telling them that, you got to protect yourselves, right? And nobody's coming. And I think that point was clearly illustrated after the Democratic Convention of 1964 in Atlantic City, where, with the effort to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the failure of the Democratic Party to seat this delegation that had been created under the rules of the Democratic Party, had not excluded Black people, but the regular Democratic Party delegation had, and their refusal to seat the effort of this coalition of S.N.C.C and C.O.R.E, which is a Council of Federated Organizations, also known as COFOS, effort to try to break the back of segregationists, and particularly the segregationist Democratic Party in the South. Not only did they not support the delegation, but when Fannie Lou Hamer is giving her famous speech describing the terror that she's facing in the South, President Johnson decides he wants to hold a press conference during the same moment that Fannie Lou Hamer is speaking to the world at that particular time of the Democratic Convention. So I think it disillusioned many people who thought that the federal government was going to come in and intervene at that particular time. Self-defense by the movement is, for me, is a form of nationalism, because it's built on the principle of self-reliance, that we can't depend upon the federal government to defend us. We're going to have to defend ourselves. And that's what the elders had been telling them all along, right? And so I think and keep in mind too, that the safety of S.N.C.C and C.O.R.E in the South, it basically come through local people protecting them. When I look at the records of both organizations in the South, they would contact the federal government anytime they faced, when I say the federal government, the Justice Department and FBI, anytime they faced any type of harassment. And a lot of times they wouldn't receive any support. There's documents that you can see in the King Center from both organizations on this. They rarely received any support. But so who did protect them was, these people who we mentioned, these local folk, and people whose names that I don't even know, who protected these folks, who provided security, who shot back when somebody shot at them, who not only did acts as resistant or bold as that, but these were the people who fed them, who provided them transportation, and then oftentimes became targets because they did provide this protection. But the federal government, as Malcolm used to say, was either unwilling or unable to do it. So it led to S.N.C.C and C.O.R.E beginning to say, well, look, we need to embrace this whole concept of Black people protecting themselves, them protecting themselves, but we need to participate in that, in defending and protecting ourselves, because I think there was a loss of faith. And I think this is also what leads and encourages the whole development of Black power, as we talked about later, that we're going to have to rely on our own resources, and we're going to have to stop these moral appeals to northern white liberals who really don't have our backs. But we got to rely on our own people and whoever wants to align themselves with our possibilities towards self-determination.
Yeah, that's a good summary there of the Southern movement. In the Northern movement, and I think overall, as I pointed out before, the youth entered the movement as troops. Malcolm had made an analysis where he said that he thought the youth had made the mistake of relying on the analysis of their leaders for direction. And I would say Malcolm was half right on that because he's an observer looking from the outside. So he's right that we did rely on their analysis when they came in. Where he's wrong is a buck private who's entering a war is in no position to come in with a strategy. And if they do, it's probably going to be a mess. And so, and in the case of S.N.C.C, they were, they benefited from the wisdom of Ella Baker, though she did her best not to intervene, let them make their own decisions, but she also led from the back when it was necessary.
Right.
But she had a more correct analysis than she even gave the movement because she wanted the movement to develop on its own. But in the case of C.O.R.E and most of the other established organizations, we had leaders who, in the case of James Farmer, was ideologically committed not only to nonviolence, but integration.
Right.
And came out of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and was a good man and was good for C.O.R.E for his time. No Freedom Ride, no James Farmer, no Freedom Ride, no national organization. And he was principled.
Right.
I mean, I respect him. But the fact is, and so he had some good ideas and some good things that contributed to the development of the organization. But over time, and I'm speaking in general, also for myself, over time, as we got our feet wet, some of us underwent awakening, we learned things through struggle. We began to develop our own analysis. And what I would say is 1963 in the general movement was the shifting point when it came to us beginning to think for ourselves. And it had to do with a lot of things. One thing is the movement becomes aware of Marcus Garvey in 63. That's that book, Black Moses, comes out. Now, people like Elijah and Malcolm and Farrakhan, they knew about it, that Elijah was a part of that movement. It's a Corporal and Garvey movement.
Right.
But a lot of us had never heard of this. And so that was the beginning of a part of an awakening, but the major awakening was coming through battles we were fighting. Our major teachers were our enemy and of our people. So we began to develop our own analysis. And as we did, then we began, many of us in the Northern movement were not ideologically committed to nonviolence. It was tactical.
Right.
And it was the organization had it, so okay, we said, we did it, we did some drills. We never had to use it. Nobody was attacking us in the North physically. But the point is over time, then, we began to question that. And then of course, this integration, that was like, we were like the grassroots in that we weren't ideological when we joined the movement. So we didn't come in, you ask us what was integration, we couldn't tell you, you know what I mean?
Right.
Talking college educated or street educated, but the masses of Black people joined because they wanted freedom and they wanted dignity. That is to be treated in a dignified way.
Right.
So over time, then that assessment came, and then that assessment is what leads to Black power, to self-defense, to an open rejection of this idea of integration. But it came through that. Malcolm was a secondary influence. And I might point out, Malcolm's closest relationship to the Black freedom movement was with C.O.R.E. And that's simply because we were everywhere where the Nation of Islam was, and he was where we were. One example is Herman Ferguson stayed with me for about a week and gave me some interesting information. I did an interview of him. It'll be posted pretty soon with him and his wife on his life experience in the movement. It's the only time he had ever been interviewed. And he told me some stuff that I won't discuss here. But Ferguson was a radical, a Black radical. What's often not noted is Ferguson was chair of the Education Committee of New York C.O.R.E. and later became chair of the Education Committee of the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
Right.
And would never acknowledge the first one.
Wow.
Because I think that he took on Malcolm's analysis and therefore didn't really see the value of his C.O.R.E involvement. So he didn't even want to talk about it, you know what I mean?
Okay.
But the key point is Malcolm influenced us secondarily, but he was a major influence. He was the most advanced thinker. Our experience was primary. And then we influenced him. I don't just mean C.O.R.E, the movement, because the movement was bigger than all of us. So, so that growth and development, I think came through struggle. Are there any concluding things you want to make, concluding remarks?
No,
next week, we'll get into the right wing and the importance of this tradition for now.
Right. And if there's anything else, I think I could just put that in the beginning of our conversation next week. But we're discussing a very nuanced way the movement during this time. Some of the things in my book, and I think again, I still consider it a conversation because I think it's an opportunity, since you're contemporary with a lot of this activity, that you can that you've been able to provide some insights. I'm interested in another time to hear about, as I call him, Baba Herman, who I had great respect for also. But so I think it's been a good time for me to reflect to having this conversation with you.
I know it's been good for everybody who's listening. This is a rich discussion and it's relevant for today. And tell people how they can get your book. We Will Shoot
Back. It's published by New York University Press, so you can go to NYU Press, nyupress.edu, or you can get it through Amazon. Get it in one of those places. If you want to contact me directly, you can go to my website, Baba, BABA-AK.com, BABA-AK.com. If you want information about me or the book, you can get it there also. Okay. BABA-AK.com.
This was really enjoyable. I learned a lot. I read your book, and there's some stuff that you went into in more depth that I didn't know about. I knew about some of the people, but some of their genesis, like, some of the things on some of the key SNCC organizers, I knew general, but, you were giving out some detailed stuff that was very interesting. I think people should go back and really dig into this. And for me, it's always, how does the past serve the present? How do you use this for now? So this has been a pleasure.
It's funny to me when I meet somebody who was in S.N.C.C in Mississippi, and they ask me, "And how did you find that out?"
Yeah, more than they do. Because we always know our stuff, but we don't always know all the stuff connected to it.
Right. Or we thought we had kept this secret. How'd you find this out?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you, brother. Really.
All right. Good talking to you again, Baba. Look forward to talking
first
to you.
Day of Kwanzaa, Umoja, unity. So we encourage people to practice unity 24/7. But today, put some emphasis on it.
Ashe.
Thank you, brother. Ashe. Really appreciate it.
And free the land.
Free the land.